Okay, you have a further question, Johan? Then it will be short. Okay, Torsten?
I'm very interested in hearing more about how government should try to internalize the externalities of investments. You mentioned that if there were any kind of government involvement, of course, there should be open access to the infrastructure. But how would you recommend, if you should choose to put taxpayer money into this, how should the government support it? What should be the ownership structure? And how would that affect the competition and the regulatory setup for authorities and us as politicians?
That sounds like a blueprint for the future, what you've put forward. It's extremely difficult because there's a tendency for governments to go out to a remote area and say, okay, we'll give money to the company, to this company to come in and invest. And usually one of the problems you find, the only company that wants to go out there is the incumbent. Which means that the government ends up strengthening the market power of the incumbent by using taxpayer money, which goes against all the requirements of competition, if you want. One way to do it is to get firms to make a bid. In other words, you have a small community out in a remote area and you want to give them a network. You ask companies to make bids for what they require as a subsidy, and the lowest bid wins. You certainly can exclude the incumbent from the bidding process, but you have to be careful because you need to be fair and open. But having an open network is important because if what you get the company to build is a dark fiber network which is open to all service providers, then any service provider can come in and provide services. We are very attached to having point-to-point fiber networks because point-to-point allows you to unbundle if you want. You can pull out a wire from your house and give it to another competitor. It's very easy to compete with that. Some of the new networks are much harder. But I'd say just give reverse subsidies. In other words, ask for a bid from companies. Make sure it's an open network which allows service competition.
I think we should give the politicians from SF and Social Democrats the opportunity to speak. Now we had comments from questions from the governmental parties. Hanne?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, and I really do agree in a lot of your points. The focus on the social benefits that actually should be the argument of public participation in these investments. Is that any further documented, or is it a prediction of the future, or do we have any documentation on what sort of social benefits, number-wise? And also the growth, because OECD has earlier highlighted some growth perspectives also on economic development. I guess you have also numbers there. I'd like to hear.
For your first question, we didn't do in-depth investigation of the health or education sector or transportation sector. All we tried to do was say, using networks, you can get certain amount of savings, efficiencies in those sectors, and if you read the literature, which usually comes from people who are health experts or transport experts, there are a lot of different applications that you can put into place. But we looked at if you had savings 0.5% to 1.5%, then that would be sufficient to justify an end to a nationwide fiber to the home network. So we didn't try and say, well, you know, this application would lead to so much economies to the country. That's much harder to do. For your second part, we haven't actually done an impact analysis to look at the impact of fiber to the home in terms of growth and productivity. I know there's many studies, and I believe you'll be hearing a presentation today on that, but there are many studies which do show a significant impact on productivity to economies.
Ole Hækkerup.
Yeah, thank you so much. Even though you don't have specific analysis that would point to productivity and growth effects from fiber, I think most people would probably agree that the road to recovery for the OECD countries are to a large extent digital. Well, I certainly do so, but let me ask you this. If you look at the OECD, how digital is the road to recovery really? Is what you see truly the old school recovery, or is it a digital recovery? Do you see governments transforming their policies, or is it more you can talk the talk?
Well, if you look at many of the stimulus packages which governments put forward during 2009, the large majority of them had what you call a digital recovery component, which was significant. The US, for example, President Obama talked about broadband, where the US is not doing that well. Talked about investing in networks, and many European countries talked about it. One thing that we have been trying to do, and not necessarily in my part of the OECD, but other parts of OECD as well, is to get governments themselves to use digital networks much more to offer services to the public, because one of the outcomes of the economic crisis and the movement towards recovery will be, of course, that governments have huge deficits, and certainly using high-speed networks is a way of creating significant efficiencies in the provision of services, and thus helping reduce government spending and in the long term reducing their deficits.